So, got a big show for you today. Got a lot of things to cover. Wanted to kind of, at the request of Pat George, wanted to kind of do a retrospective of some of the big stories of the year this year. And, there were so many big stories, but if you look at some of the news sites that have ranked the biggest stories of the year based on what people are interested in, probably the biggest story of the year here in the U.S. is the impeachment of President Trump, which just occurred.
Has it?
Well, that's an interesting question. They've had votes. They've had votes on a couple of articles of impeachment, but they haven't named House managers for the impeachment, and they haven't delivered those articles to the Senate. So, some people say that he's not impeached until the articles are delivered to the Senate for trial. But we don't know at this point exactly where things stand. I mean, certainly this seems to be an unprecedented scenario where the president is impeached, and yet the articles have not been delivered to the Senate for trial. I mean, that was kind of the whole point, is to get to the trial. Because what the House does is it votes on whether or not to impeach the president, and then the Senate conducts a trial. And some of us remember this from not so long ago history, when President Clinton was impeached during his term, related to different crimes that he had committed with respect to Monica Lewinsky, including perjury, where he hadn't told the truth under oath about a number of things, including whether or not he had a relationship with Monica Lewinsky. So that's one of the stories that we want to cover in the show, and that one actually starts much, much earlier this year, back in, it's been going on basically the whole time President Trump has been in office. But one of the big things that occurred in the storyline occurred in February 14th of this year, and that is when the Senate confirmed William Barr as the 85th Attorney General of the United States. Now, they did that by a 54-45 vote. It was a bipartisan confirmation, with Doug Jones of Alabama, Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, and Joe Manchin of West Virginia, all voting in favor of confirmation. And, of course, as you probably remember, Bill Barr was also an attorney general under George Herbert Walker Bush. He was the 77th attorney general. So he's the 77th, and now he's the 85th attorney general. And, of course, he's been very influential, involved in the Trump situation, and particularly with respect to the Russia investigation that was ongoing until this year. And that's another big piece of the storyline, frankly, is what happened in conclusion of the Russia investigation. And you may remember that happened shortly after Bill Barr was confirmed. 22 March of this year, the Mueller report was completed and sent to the Department of Justice in its final form. Now, if you remember the Mueller report, it was about 448 pages, and it was broken down into two different volumes. And you had Volume 1, which had to do with collusion or conspiracy between the Trump campaign and the government of Russia to have some effect on the election positive for Trump. And, of course, that volume concluded that there was no evidence that the Trump campaign colluded or conspired with the Russian government, which, of course, was the main point of the entire investigation. Now, the investigation had been going on for 2 years, but they apparently knew as early as late 2017 that there was absolutely no evidence of a conspiracy with Russia and the Trump campaign. So beyond that time, the next year and several months of investigation was all about trying to look into obstruction of justice. And some people assert was trying to lay a trap for President Trump, hoping that he would do something rash, like fire Bob Mueller or shut down the investigation. By the way, both of which would be technically within his powers as the chief executive. And it's hard to imagine how you could be exercising powers that you have as the chief executive and somehow thereby obstructing justice. In other words, he's technically in charge of the investigation into himself. So he could have ended it, but he did not. He let it run its entire course until Bob Mueller finally had nothing further that he could do and produced his report. And when he actually produced the report then, Volume 2 of the report, which is, the one that sort of irritates people, is the one related to allegations of obstruction of justice. And in Volume 2, Bob Mueller and Andrew Weissman and his team, which included at times Peter Strzok and others. I mean, Peter Strzok, there's a name that we've learned to know very well, but his team included those people, and he basically discussed 11 different episodes of alleged possible obstruction of justice. And this was such a strange thing for Bob Mueller to do because this was not the normal function of a prosecutor. Normally, a prosecutor just makes a prosecutorial decision, and if there's enough evidence to indict, the prosecutor indicts. If there's not enough evidence to indict, the prosecutor doesn't typically put out a report running through all the different things that we may have found, some of the allegations that we looked at, etc., because that is defamatory of the individual. And in the United States of America, you're supposed to be innocent until you're proven guilty. So it's not supposed to be an opportunity for law enforcement to go through, well, these are all the allegations that we had against the person, and here's some of the evidence that we looked at, etc. But that's exactly what Bob Mueller did in Volume 2 of his report, which was so irritating to many people, particularly legal scholars. Now, people who hate President Trump, they were very happy for that, and they thought that was particularly appropriate in the case of President Trump, that his name be dragged through the mud on all these possible crimes. And, of course, the conclusion, which was a non-conclusion of Volume 2, was that we didn't conclude that President Trump committed a crime, but we also don't exonerate him. Now, that's something prosecutors never do. Prosecutors never come out and exonerate somebody. They either charge him or her, or they don't charge him or her. And if they don't charge him, well, then guess what? You're innocent until you're proven guilty. And they're not charging you because they know they cannot prove you guilty. So you're entitled to what's called the presumption of innocence. But, of course, Bob Mueller refused to make that prosecutorial decision, instead kicking it back to the Department of Justice. And that decision was made 2 days later on 24 March by Attorney General William Barr, who said that he and Rod Rosenstein reviewed the report, and they concluded, after review, that there was not sufficient evidence to establish that President Trump committed a crime. And that was, period, the end on the Russia investigation, although later in the year, Bob Mueller decided to come to Congress. And, of course, he claimed to be doing it, only half willingly, that he really didn't want to testify. And on 24 July of 2019, he testified to Congress in a halting and confused manner. It seemed like he did not even know the contents of his own report. And he frequently would say, in answer to questions, things like, "That's not in my purview." And one of the notable points that he testified to, which I thought was particularly interesting, was that he didn't even know who Fusion GPS was. Now, Fusion GPS was the group run by Glenn Simpson, you remember that, Schreiner, who put together the Steele dossier.
Right.
And they say that even Steele really wasn't maybe even the primary author of the dossier that bears his name, that maybe it was really Nellie Orr and others who were working under contract with Fusion GPS. But Bob Mueller didn't even know. And remember, the Steele dossier was like the entire basis for the Russia investigation. It's the entire basis for these FISA warrants that they went and got. Now, they'll say, there was a lot of other evidence that was involved in this. But if you read between the lines and you look at what we actually know about, we know that the Steele dossier was the basis. Now, there may have been a few extra things that they tagged on, they added on, but truly, the Steele dossier was the central basis for this entire hoax Russia investigation that's occurred over the past several years. And, of course, Bob Mueller doesn't even know about the group that produced the Steele dossier. So what kind of an investigation was he really running? We're going to talk some more about that when we come back. Thank you for listening to the Morgan Streetman Show. We hope you enjoyed what you heard, and if you did, please click like and subscribe to help us out. And remember that we recommend that you exercise your brain at least once a week.